I sensed the wrongness before I even reached the gate, the kind of instinct that rises from training long before thought can catch up. It was 1:40 in the morning at Fort Harrison, and the Montana wind was cutting sideways across the snowfields, pushing drifts against the concrete barriers and rattling the chain link like distant static. My shift had ended only minutes earlier, and all I wanted was heat and silence. But something at the edge of the barracks gate pulled my attention so sharply that my breath stalled in my chest. A shape lay slumped just outside the security line, half covered in blowing snow, unmoving except for the slightest tremor in one hand. I stepped toward the fence slowly because part of me refused to believe what my instincts already knew, and the other part was preparing for the moment they were proven right. My boots crunched through ice as I crossed into the glow of the gate floodlight, and the beam finally revealed the face beneath the frost. My grandfather, Arthur Mercer, was lying in the snow, his breath thin, his skin pale from cold exposure, and his eyes barely open as if fighting to stay in this world long enough to recognize me. For a second, I could not breathe. The man who raised me, the man who taught me how to stand straight and throw a punch in a world that never stopped swinging, had been left here alone outside a military installation, as if he were nothing more than an unwanted package. I dropped to my knees beside him, letting protocol slide for one suspended heartbeat, because training can wait, but blood cannot. His coat was crooked and his gloves were missing, and when I touched his shoulder, he flinched weakly from the cold. "Rowan," he whispered, and the way he said my name cracked something deep inside me. I signaled to the gate guard, Corporal Jensen, who was already rushing forward with his radio in hand, calling for medics, while I checked Arthur's pulse, shallow but present. Then I noticed the slip of paper tucked awkwardly into the chest pocket of his flannel shirt. The corner was stiff with frozen moisture, but the handwriting was unmistakable. "You handle it, Linda." No explanation. No attempt to hide the intention, just a casual dismissal written by the woman who married my father and spent the last decade pretending she cared more about family than convenience. My jaw tightened, but before I could even start to process that, Jensen called out that he had pulled the security feed. His expression had shifted from confusion to something darker. "Staff Sergeant, the footage shows a car stopping here at 1:02, a silver sedan registered to Linda Mercer." She did not even pause. She left him here and drove away. The words echoed in the cold air, sharper than the wind. I looked down at Arthur, and his lips parted in a small, painful effort to speak. "They made me sign," he murmured, barely audible under the siren of the approaching base ambulance. "They took documents. They said it was for the best." Each word trembled out of him as if dragged through icy water, and every instinct I had as a soldier, as a granddaughter, as someone who had survived deployments by reading danger in the smallest details, told me this was not an accident. This was intentional. This was planned, and whatever had happened to him tonight was only the surface of something much deeper. The medics arrived, sliding the stretcher beside us, and I kept my hand on his shoulder as they lifted him because his gaze never left mine, and I refused to let him feel alone for even a second more. As they secured him inside the ambulance, I replayed the facts: the timestamp, the car, the note, the fading strength in his voice. Nothing aligned with care or concern. Everything pointed to coercion and abandonment and a kind of cold calculation that twisted my stomach. The ambulance doors shut, but before they did, I leaned close so he could see me clearly through the haze of shock and cold. "I am here, Grandpa," I said, and I meant it. The way soldiers mean their oaths: steady, unbreakable, absolute. "I will figure out what happened. I will not let this slide." His eyes softened the smallest bit and then fluttered closed as the medics continued working. When the vehicle pulled away, Jensen stepped beside me, his breath fogging in the air. "What do you need, Staff Sergeant?" I stared at the fading red lights of the ambulance, knowing exactly what needed to come next. "I need the full security recording. I need a copy of the transport log. And I need every detail from the moment that car stopped at the gate, because this was not a mistake. This was a message, and I intended to answer it." The ambulance had already disappeared beyond the barracks turnoff when I forced myself to steady my breath and refocus on the tasks that procedure demanded. It was still 0140 on the dot, the same minute I had first seen my grandfather lying in the snow, but the seconds since then had stretched in my mind like long, uneven shadows. Cold air bit at my face as I stood beneath the gate floodlight reviewing the steps that had to follow. Shock could not be allowed to override protocol no matter how loudly my pulse thundered in my ears. Corporal Jensen hovered near the guard booth, his radio clipped open, and the base medics en route to the hospital with my grandfather. He kept glancing at me with a mixture of concern and uncertainty. "Staff Sergeant, do you want the log pulled now?" His voice was careful, as if he sensed the tight coil sitting behind my calm. "Yes, pull everything from 0100 to 0140, and send me the plates from the vehicle that stopped at 0102. He nodded once and stepped back inside the booth. I could see the glow of the monitor reflecting against the glass, stuttering each time he scrubbed through the security feed. My boots were still planted in the snow where I had knelt beside Arthur minutes earlier, and though the wind continued tearing across the asphalt, I barely felt the cold. The only thing I felt was disbelief sharpened by anger, held in disciplined restraint. My grandfather had been left outside a military installation in freezing temperatures by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And that someone had taken the time to tuck a note into his pocket telling me to handle it. When Jensen returned, he held a printed sheet, his brow creased. The footage shows a silver sedan arriving at 0102. No hesitation, no attempt to call for help. Driver steps out, opens the passenger door, helps your grandfather just far enough to place him outside the fence, then drives off. And the plates match. Linda Mercer. There it was spoken aloud as if the cold air itself flinched at the name. My stepmother had driven my grandfather to a restricted gate in the dead of night and left him in the snow without so much as contacting emergency services. My hands curled reflexively before I forced them to relax. Anger was easy. Training demanded control. I inhaled through my nose, letting the breath anchor me rather than ignite me. Did the camera catch her face? Jensen shook his head, not clearly, but the match on the plates is solid. I took the paper from him, studying the timestamp, the exact sequence of events. There was no panic in her movements, no urgency, no attempt to comfort or assist. She had acted with the detachment of someone unloading a piece of luggage. The wind gusted again, carrying with it the faint echo of my grandfather's strained voice. She took documents they made me sign. His words had trembled out of him with the fragility of someone who had endured far more than cold. Whatever had happened before he was left at the gate was bigger than a careless act. This was deliberate, and it had purpose. I turned away from the booth, walking toward the ambulance bay, even though the vehicle was already gone. Motion helped me focus, reminded me to keep moving forward. Standing still meant drowning in emotion, and soldiers did not have that luxury. Jensen followed at a respectful distance, knowing better than to speak until I was ready. I stopped near the barrier where the snow had been disturbed by the medic's boots. The imprint of my knee was still there beside the faint outline of where my grandfather had lain. My throat tightened, but I kept my expression controlled. As an MP, I had handled scenes involving civilians, military families, and even the occasional case that made seasoned officers stare at the floor. But nothing had prepared me for seeing my own blood lying helpless outside the gate I swore to protect. Protocol required me to file an incident report. Even now, I could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing against the emotional chaos inside me. The law did not bend because the victim was family. I reached into my coat, pulled out my tablet, and opened the required form. My fingers moved automatically, documenting time of discovery, physical condition, environmental exposure, the witness account from Jensen, and the footage timestamp. I paused when I reached the section titled Nature of Abandonment. My hand hesitated for half a second before I typed the description plainly. Elder left outside restricted area by known civilian at 0102. Possible coercion indicated by victim's statements. As soon as the words were entered, I felt a tightness settle behind my ribs. Writing it made it real. Writing it meant I could no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding. Once the report uploaded to the base server, I exhaled slowly. Jensen approached again, uncertain. "Staff Sergeant, are you all right?" I looked at him and answered with the steadiness I had learned in every deployment and every investigation. "No, but I will be. I need a transport to the hospital as soon as possible." He nodded immediately. "I'll notify dispatch and get you clearance." When he turned away, I glanced back at the snow one last time. The cold, the darkness, the place where my grandfather had been left alone for 40 minutes that could have ended his life. The wrongness of it hit me again with a force that clenched my jaw. This was not negligence. This was not confusion. This was an act carried out with intent, and intent always left a trail. As the base vehicle approached, I tightened my gloves and climbed inside, giving the driver the hospital's address. The moment the door shut, I felt the silence wrap around me, mixing with the vision of Arthur's frail hand gripping mine. I had promised him I would figure out what happened. Now that promise had become something sharper than duty, something rooted deeper than blood. It was resolve, and I intended to follow it wherever it led. The ride to the hospital cut through the empty streets of Helena, where the winter lights along the storefronts flickered softly against the snow-crusted sidewalks. I watched the blur of passing houses' old familiar silhouettes carrying pieces of a past I had never fully confronted. The heater in the transport hummed low, but the cold inside me did not lift. Instead, it settled deeper as memories surfaced one by one without permission. Helena had always been a place of contradictions for me, familiar and unforgiving home and exile. I grew up in a small rental on South Rodney Street, close enough to Mercer Ridge that I could see the tree line from my bedroom window. My grandfather used to joke that the land was stubborn like every Mercer before me, and that I had inherited the same streak. Those were the days before my father remarried, before the quiet tension in our home thickened into something sharp enough to cut. I was 19 when Linda entered our lives, a polished smile and a controlling calm wrapped in the same package. She met my father at a community benefit dinner, and within months, she was living in our house, rearranging furniture schedules, routines, and roles until it felt like everything had always belonged to her. My father, Stephen, fell under her influence faster than I expected. After my mother passed, he carried a grief that softened him, and Linda knew exactly how to press into that softness, until he leaned on her more than he should have. By the time I joined the Army, she had woven herself so tightly into our household that it felt like stepping outside a tightening circle every time I returned home. But there was one thing she could not control: my relationship with my grandfather. Arthur saw through her long before any of us did. He never said it outright, but I could read it in the way his jaw tightened when she walked into a room, and the way he pulled me aside on the porch after dinner to remind me who I was without her influence. She hated the closeness between us. She hated the way he still kept the original deed to Mercer Ridge locked in his safe, refusing to add her name, despite her soft attempts to persuade him. Most of all, she hated that Arthur favored me, not because I demanded it, but because he recognized the fights I carried, the ones I never voiced aloud. The transport rounded a corner, and the hospital lights appeared in the distance, causing a knot to form in my throat. As the vehicle slowed, I remembered the last visit I had made to his cabin. It was early November cold, but not harsh yet, and he had greeted me with a warmth that melted every layer of military armor I had collected over the years. He had insisted on brewing coffee on the old enamel stove, the one he refused to replace, claiming newer models lacked soul. We sat quietly, our mugs steaming in the dim light, as he traced the grain of the wooden table my father had carved when he was 16. The silence between us had felt loaded. Finally, he looked at me with eyes that seemed to search deeper than normal. "Rowan," he said, "if anything happens to me, don't trust Linda and Stephen." I remember the way my pulse spiked, the way I leaned in to ask why, but he shook his head and brushed it aside with a frail laugh, as though his warning had been a passing concern. I had let it go then, but now the words came back with a weight that pressed against my ribs. I stepped out of the transport and walked toward the entrance, letting the automated doors sweep open in front of me. The warmth inside the hospital brushed over my frozen cheeks, but the unease did not fade. The memories continued to unspool without mercy. Linda's subtle manipulation had been a pattern from the beginning. She wielded politeness like a blade smoothing edges while cutting deeper beneath the surface. She would tell my father I misunderstood her tone, Tell the neighbors that Arthur was forgetful when he contradicted her stories. Tell me that my reactions were evidence of military rigidity rather than actual concern. Gaslighting so smooth it could have passed for misunderstanding if I had not learned to trust my instincts. When Arthur misplaced his medication, she blamed his age. When he missed a payment because she had moved the bills, she blamed confusion. When he hesitated to sign something, she insisted he was tiring easily. And when he tried to push back, she offered help in that soft, patient voice that masked pressure under the surface. I had always sensed the imbalance, but deployments and distance made it easy to dismiss small inconsistencies. Each one alone looked like a simple oversight. Together, they were threads in a larger pattern, a pattern I had not fully acknowledged until tonight. The moment I saw my grandfather lying outside the barracks gate, the scattered moments of doubt began sliding into place, forming a picture I had avoided drawing. I reached the elevators and pressed the button. My reflection caught in the metal doors looked like someone caught between two worlds. The granddaughter who wanted to storm into every room demanding answers, and the staff sergeant who knew emotion had to be contained until facts aligned. That tension pulled tight inside me, the same tension that had shaped much of my adult life. As the elevator rose, I replayed pieces of Linda's voice through the years, each fragment now sounding different under the harsh light of tonight's truth. He gets confused, you know. He needs someone to manage things. He's lucky we're here to help. The bitterness in those lines felt unmistakable now. When the doors opened onto the medical floor, I stepped out with a steadying breath, tracing the memories that had resurfaced. Arthur's warning, Linda's control, Stephen's silence, the subtle but persistent attempts to isolate my grandfather from the decisions involving Mercer Ridge. The land had always been more than dirt and trees. It was legacy and history and identity, and that made it valuable. Too valuable for someone like Linda to ignore. I paused outside the waiting room, feeling the truth settle deeper. The signs had been there for years, scattered across conversations, across seasons, across moments I had brushed aside. Now they were returning with urgency, demanding to be seen in full. My grandfather had tried to warn me, but I had not listened carefully enough. Tonight had forced me to finally follow the trail he left, and whatever lay at the end of it would not be simple. The VA hospital in Helena always carried a certain quiet at night, a mix of humming vents, muted footsteps, and the soft echo of monitors that made every hallway feel like it was holding its breath. When I stepped onto the medical floor, the lights were dimmed and the scent of antiseptic drifted like a reminder that this place held both healing and truth. A nurse at the desk recognized my uniform and the urgency in my expression and pointed me toward room 214 without asking anything more than my name. When I reached the doorway, I paused, letting myself gather the composure that training demanded, but nothing in my training had prepared me for the sight of my grandfather, pale against the hospital sheets with heated blankets layered over him and an oxygen line crossing his cheek. His skin held the faint bluish tint of cold exposure, and his breaths were shallow, rising in small, uneven lifts beneath the blanket. A doctor stepped in from the opposite side, adjusting the monitors with a calm but focused precision. "You must be Staff Sergeant Mercer." I nodded, stepping closer to the bed. "How is he, sir?" The doctor studied the chart, then his expression softened just slightly. "He is stable for now, but he came in with marked hypothermia and dehydration. His body temperature was well below safe levels when he arrived. At his age, that can be very dangerous." I swallowed hard, my gaze drifting down to Arthur's hands resting limp on the blanket. The doctor hesitated, then added with a subtle shift in tone. "There is also bruising along the wrists consistent with being pulled or handled roughly. It is not severe, but it is there." The words sank into me slowly and then, all at once. Bruising along the wrists, pulled or handled roughly. Someone had not just abandoned him. Someone had dragged him. The doctor continued, "We are monitoring him closely. He will need warmth fluids and rest. Once he wakes, we can assess cognitive function and gather details if he is able to share them." I thanked him because professionalism required it, but internally I felt an anger rising that I could only manage by standing perfectly still. When he left, I moved to the chair beside the bed, letting myself sit for the first time since the moment I saw Arthur outside the gate. His hand looked fragile beneath the warm light, and I reached for it carefully, afraid the slightest movement might hurt him. His fingers twitched at my touch, and slowly his eyelids fluttered open, revealing a faint glimmer of recognition. "Rowan," he whispered, and I leaned forward so he would not have to strain. "I am here, Grandpa. You are safe now." His breath shuddered in his chest as he tried to focus on me, his voice thin, like paper. "They wanted my signature." His words drifted, then steadied. "For the land. Mercer Ridge." The room seemed to tighten around me, as if every wall leaned in. Mercer Ridge. The 68-acre stretch my family had held for 3 generations, the land Arthur protected with fierce devotion, the land Linda had repeatedly hinted should be sold. "What do you mean they wanted your signature?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady despite the tightening in my jaw. He blinked slowly, gathering strength. "They said it was time, said I was too old to manage it. They brought papers, made me sign." His voice slipped momentarily, swallowed by fatigue, then returned with a tremble. "I did not want to." But they pushed. My stomach twisted as the implications formed. Linda had been pressuring him for years, but to bring papers without explanation to corner him while he was vulnerable to forced compliance for land transfer, that was something far darker. "Grandpa," I said carefully, "do you remember who gave you the papers?" He swallowed, then nodded faintly. "Linda. And the boy. Tyler. They said it was for the best, said it was only to simplify things. But it was not. It was never that, ever." His breath wavered, and I squeezed his hand, gently grounding him. "You did nothing wrong. You hear me? You did nothing wrong." But inside, I felt something cold sharpen into purpose. If they had tricked him into signing something, they could also have forged his signature or altered documents after the fact. Linda would not hesitate to manipulate a situation if it meant controlling Mercer Ridge. She had always resented the fact that the land would never belong to her, no matter how much she tried to wedge herself into family decisions. And now, with Arthur aging, she saw her chance. My grandfather's eyes closed again, but his grip on my hand tightened with a frail desperation. "Do not let them take it," he whispered, barely audible. "It is your father's legacy, and yours." I felt the weight of those words settle over me heavier than any responsibility I had carried in uniform. My father's legacy. My grandfather's trust, my family's history. I leaned forward, brushing my thumb lightly across the back of his hand, promising him with quiet certainty, "I will not let them take anything from you. Just rest. I have it now." As he drifted back into sleep, I sat back in the chair, replaying every detail he had given me. Papers, pressure, land, signatures, Mercer Ridge. The outlines of betrayal grew clearer, forming a structure of intent rather than accident. My mind traced the possibilities. If they coerced him into signing something, were those signatures valid? If they had forged his handwriting, would that hold up legally? If they had filed any documents today or planned to file them tomorrow, the land could already be slipping into their control. A forged contract could move quickly if unchecked. I rubbed my temple, trying to piece together timelines. The land office opened at 9. If Linda had prepared papers, she could file them as early as morning. That meant whatever justice needed to be pursued had to start before dawn. Or, the Army taught me that information without action was useless. I stood slowly, letting one last look rest on my grandfather. His breathing was steady now, sheltered by medical care, but the fear in his earlier words lingered like frost on my skin. Someone had tried to steal not just land, but dignity, exploiting an old man who trusted too much. They had crossed a line deeper than they understood. And tonight, in that dimly lit hospital room, I felt a clarity forming in my chest, one that aligned with the instincts that shaped my life. This was no longer just a family dispute. This was coercion, manipulation, and betrayal. This was the beginning of something I intended to pursue, until the truth stood clear and the people responsible faced consequences they thought they could escape. And for the first time since seeing him in the snow, I felt solid, sure, and fiercely determined. Justice would not wait. The drive from the VA hospital to my grandfather's cabin cut through the darkest stretch of Helena where the pine trees leaned in close and the road glimmered beneath patches of black ice. I kept both hands tight on the wheel, not because of the weather, but because the anger surfacing in me was beginning to pulse like a second heartbeat. Every fragment of what Arthur had told me circled my mind on repeat. Papers, pressure, land, signatures. If Linda had taken advantage of him before abandoning him at the barracks gate, then whatever waited inside his home would tell the rest of the story. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky had begun to lighten with the faintest suggestion of dawn, a dull gray bleeding over the tree line. I stepped out into the brittle morning air and paused just long enough to register the wrongness. The back door was open an uneven crack where the deadbolt should have been. It had not been forced with skill. It had been forced with impatience. My stomach tightened. I approached silently, letting every bit of military training guide my movements. Check surroundings, listen for movement, enter low and ready. When I pushed the door fully open, it groaned loud against the frame, revealing footprints in the dusting of snow that had blown inside. They led into the kitchen, where drawers were scattered open pill bottles dumped across the tile in chaotic piles. I knelt beside them, scanning labels, blood pressure meds, pain management, vitamins. Several prescriptions were missing entirely. Someone had not come for valuables. They had come for anything that documented his health and his vulnerability. My jaw clenched as I rose and followed the footprints down the hallway. The living room bore the same disorder books knocked from shelves, blankets shoved aside, the wooden table my father carved pulled an inch off center as though someone had braced against it. But it was the safe in the corner that froze me. The steel door hung open crooked and bent where the hinges had been pried until they gave. Inside lay scattered documents, envelopes torn open, paper edges bent and smudged. I stepped closer, bending down to examine the disarray. My fingers brushed over tax statements, old letters, property records, and then something heavier. A stack of legal papers slightly damp at the edges and weighted with the coldness of intent. They were contracts, land transfer documents. I pulled the top sheet into the light and felt a coldness spread through me deeper than the winter air outside. Mercer Ridge. Land transfer full ownership reassigned to Linda Mercer dated 3 weeks earlier during a period when my grandfather had been sick enough to miss Thanksgiving dinner for the first time in my life. His signature appeared near the bottom, a shaky, uncertain scrawl that bore none of the steady lines he used even in old age. It trembled so badly the pen strokes stuttered. It looked like a man battling illness, fighting for clarity, trying to resist. My chest tightened not with surprise, but with confirmation. Witness signature Tyler Donovan, the name spelled neatly with a flourish as if proud to be listed. Linda's son. A man who had always hovered around the family's finances with too much interest and too little tact. And then the notary signature, Caleb Dorse. My pulse kicked harder. Caleb was known locally for pushing legal boundaries. He had been disciplined twice for approving signatures without verifying identity. He was the kind of man who believed consequences were optional if he was paid well enough. This was no misunderstanding. This was a coordinated attempt to strip an old man of his property, to manipulate him while sick and vulnerable, and then discard him once they believed they had everything they wanted. I felt heat rising in my throat, the kind that precedes decisions made from instinct, not hesitation. I pulled out my phone, scrolling to the number I had not used since my deployment ended. Sergeant Dana Caldwell, CID specialist, sharp as a blade and twice as unforgiving when she sensed corruption. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but alert, the instant she recognized my tone. "Rowan, what happened?" I took a steadying breath, but my words shook with tightly held anger. "I need your eyes on something. Elder coercion. Possible fraud, possible forced signature, and they left him at my barracks gate last night." There was a pause, sharp and clean. "Send me everything. Photos, dates, names." I snapped pictures of the documents, every page, every signature, every timestamp capturing the damage done to the safe and the disarray throughout the room. When I sent them through, Dana's reply came fast. "This smells like elder coercion and fraud. Heavy fraud. And from the look of the signature lines, someone guided his hand or signed over him." My grip on the phone tightened. Dana continued, "You need to lock this scene. Do not let anyone in. And Rowan, whoever did this will not stop unless someone stops them." Her words hit with the precision of a truth I already knew. They had not stolen from a stranger. They had tried to erase a man who had built our family from the ground up. They had tried to steal land soaked in 3 generations of sweat and sacrifice. And when they finished using him, they abandoned him like refuse at the edge of a military base. I stood slowly, letting the cabin settle into silence around me, the weight of my grandfather's life present in every wooden wall, every framed picture, every inch of ground outside. This place had been refuge, legacy, memory. Someone had come here intending to destroy all of it. My eyes drifted to the window where dawn finally broke, casting faint light across Mercer Ridge in the distance. That land was not just acres. It was the center of our identity. And tonight, it had nearly been taken by people who believed an old man's voice no longer mattered. I turned back toward the wrecked safe, grounding myself in the resolve forming within me. They thought no one would find out. They thought abandoning him would silence him. They thought I would not fight. They were wrong. The drive to Linda's house felt shorter than it should have, as though the anger pushing behind my ribs had collapsed the distance between us, pulling me forward with a force I could not slow. The sky was fully awake now, a pale Montana morning stretching over the rooftops in a thin wash of cold light. Frost clung to the edges of mailboxes, to the brittle grass, to every surface that reminded me this day had begun with betrayal and would continue with truth. When I pulled into the driveway of the 2-story home Linda and Tyler shared, I sat for a moment gripping the steering wheel as I watched the curtains shift slightly in the front window. They had seen me arrive. Good. Let them feel the weight of that. I stepped out of the truck and crossed the walk with a controlled pace, the kind drilled into me through years of military bearing. I knocked once firm and unmistakable. The door opened quickly, too quickly, as if they had been waiting for the knock they always feared would come. Linda stood in a robe, her hair curled neatly as though chaos had not touched her world in weeks. Behind her, Tyler hovered with a smirk already forming at the corner of his mouth, as though he had rehearsed the expression. Rowan Linda said, her tone dripping with false warmth. "What a surprise. You could have called, you know." I held her gaze without returning the pretense. "We need to talk. Now." She stepped aside with a softness that never matched her intentions, and I walked into the living room where the smell of fresh coffee clashed with the rising bitterness inside me. Tyler leaned against the counter, arms folded, wearing that practiced arrogance of someone who believed he had outmaneuvered the world. Before I could speak, Linda lifted her chin and began the performance she had perfected over the years. "If this is about your grandfather," she said gently, "you should know he has been very confused lately. He forgets things, mixes up events. He gets overwhelmed. It is not his fault." It was the tone that did it, the soft, patronizing cadence designed to paint herself as the reasonable one while casting doubt over anything my grandfather said. My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice steady. Confused men are not abandoned outside military gates at 1 a.m. Her eyes flicked away for a moment. Tyler stepped forward with a sigh, exaggerated enough to make my teeth clench. "Look, Rowan, you are overreacting. You are military. Everything to you is a threat or a mission or some big emergency. Maybe if you stepped back, you would see he just needed help and did not know how to accept it." I let the words hang in the air for a long second. Gaslighting so smooth it almost sparkled under the morning light. They wanted me to doubt what I had seen, what Arthur had said, what the evidence in his cabin had made unmistakable. But I had spent too many years learning how to separate truth from distortion to fall for that now. I pulled the photocopies of the land transfer contract from my jacket and placed them quietly on the table between us. The movement wiped the smirk off Tyler's face faster than any argument could have. Linda's expression tightened, but she forced a smile that looked more like a cracked mask. "What is this supposed to be?" she asked, with a practiced innocence that no longer fooled me. "You tell me," I said. "These were in the safe you broke into. Papers signed while my grandfather was sick, witnessed by your son, notarized by a man who has been disciplined for fraud." Linda crossed her arms, but her breathing hitched just slightly, a betrayal her voice did not show. "Rowan, You are making something out of nothing. Your grandfather agreed to those papers. He told us he did not want the responsibility anymore." She reached for the documents, but I moved them away before her hand touched them. "He told me last month not to trust either of you with anything involving the land." Her eyes narrowed sharp and defensive. "You misunderstood him. He was tired. He needed guidance. He needed family." Tyler snorted under his breath, shaking his head like this entire conversation bored him. "Old man could not take care of himself anyway," he muttered loud enough that he wanted me to hear. The sentence struck with a thud in my chest. I felt heat rise in me, but I kept my stance still grounded in the discipline drilled into me through years of service. I turned fully toward him. "Do not ever call him that again." He shrugged, smirking again, as if leaning into the cruelty gave him power. Linda stepped between us quickly, palms up in a false gesture of peace. "Let us not get dramatic," she said. "You always did have a temper, and the military only made it harder for you to see normal situations for what they are. Overreacting, temper, misinterpreting." The words layered themselves in the air like a familiar poison. They had used them for years to twist every concern into a flaw, every observation into paranoia, every warning into instability. But today, the fog they once created had cleared. Now all I saw were two people cornered and desperate to maintain control of a story that had already begun to crack. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so that the words landed with precision. "Listen carefully. If this contract was forged, if you forced him to sign while sick, if you misled him in any way, I will turn this entire house inside out until every truth you buried is exposed." Linda's expression shifted for the first time into something raw and unguarded, a flicker of fear mixed with anger. Then she straightened her back, snapped the mask back into place, and hissed through clenched teeth, "You always thought you were better than us just because you wear that uniform." The line was meant to cut, but it only clarified what I already knew. This was never about concern. It was about control. Linda wanted status. Tyler wanted power, and both of them believed I was the obstacle in the way of taking what did not belong to them. I leaned forward just enough that she felt the certainty in my tone. "This is not about a uniform. This is about what you did to an 87-year-old man, and I am going to find out everything." When I turned toward the door, neither of them tried to stop me. Their silence was the first honest thing they had offered in years. I had barely pulled out of Linda's driveway when my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. For a second, I considered ignoring it. My pulse was still pounding from the confrontation, and the tightness in my chest had not eased since seeing the forged contract. But something in my instincts, the same instincts that had kept me alive in far harsher places, told me to answer. A tentative voice came through the speaker. "Rowan, this is Maggie Harper. I used to live next door to your grandfather before I moved 2 streets over. I know this is sudden, but can you stop by my place? It's about Arthur." The way she said his name, careful, almost protective, sent a cold current through me. I turned the wheel and headed toward her small house on Ridgeview Lane, a place I had visited countless times as a child. The drive felt heavier than it should have. When I arrived, Maggie opened the door immediately as though she had been standing there waiting. She was in her 70s now, her posture a little stooped, her winter sweater thick and buttoned high at the collar. But her eyes carried the same sharp perceptiveness she had when she watched us play in the yard decades ago. She motioned me inside without a word. The smell of cedar and old books filled the room, a stark contrast to the chaos I had just left behind. "Rowan," she said softly, closing the door. "I wasn't sure when to call you, but your grandfather made me promise to give you something only if things ever seemed wrong. And from what I heard this morning, things are wrong." My pulse quickened. She reached into a small, carved wooden box on her counter and pulled out a USB drive wrapped in a folded sheet of lined paper. "He gave this to me in October. He said if anything happened, or if anyone tried to take the land, you'd know what to do." October. Weeks before he became severely ill. Weeks before Linda and Tyler pushed him into signing anything. My breath caught. "Did he say why he recorded something?" Maggie nodded slowly. "He said he wanted proof. And he didn't trust the people in his house. He never said names, but he didn't have to. My throat tightened. I took the USB from her with a steady hand, though inside me something trembled. Thank you for trusting me with this. She placed her hand on my arm gently. Rowan. Whatever is on that drive broke his heart. I could see it in how he carried himself afterward. I didn't ask questions, but I think he knew his time was running short to protect what mattered. I left her house with a weight I had not expected. The USB felt small in my hand, but heavy in meaning. I didn't wait to drive home. Instead, I pulled into an empty lot overlooking the valley, plugged the USB into my laptop, and opened the single folder inside, labeled October 12, 2024. The first file was a video. Shaky at first, like the camera had been set on a table and adjusted. Then, the image sharpened. My grandfather sat in his chair, wearing a flannel shirt, his breathing already more labored than I remembered from that month, but he was alone. The door behind him was shut. Then voices. Linda's voice came first, sharp, impatient. Come on, Arthur, just sign it. This is what Stephen wanted. You're making this harder than it needs to be. My stomach twisted. Tyler's voice followed louder, mocking. Just sign it, Arthur. You're old. You won't even notice the difference. My breath stilled. I watched as the camera shifted slightly when someone placed a stack of papers in front of him. Arthur lifted his trembling hand, trying to read the top page. I zoomed the video in. He squinted, lips trembling, as he whispered something I couldn't hear. Then Linda's voice again. Stop overthinking. You can't manage that land anymore. We're helping you. Now sign. He hesitated. His hand trembled violently and his chest rose in shallow, staggered breaths. But the worst part came next. Tyler grabbed his wrist not violently enough to injure him, but firmly enough that the movement was unmistakable, and pressed a pen between his fingers. Sign. His voice carried a smirk even without being seen. Just sign it so we can all move on. Arthur struggled, his breath catching. I could hear the pain in the sound. His hand jerked once, twice, as if he was trying to pull away. But Tyler held firm. The pen tip dragged shakily across the page as Arthur's entire arm trembled. I felt something inside me fracture. The video ended abruptly when Linda walked toward the camera, her hand reaching forward, the footage cutting to black. My hands were shaking. I forced them still. I opened the second file, an audio recording. Arthur's voice came through faint and strained. I didn't want to sign it. They said it was just a form. They said it would help with taxes. Then silence. Then a ragged breath. I think they want the land. Mercer Ridge. They won't say it, but I know. I closed my eyes as the last seconds of the recording played the hollow quiet of a man sitting alone in fear. Heat rose behind my eyes. Not tears, but a sharpness that bordered on pain. Anger and grief collided in my chest in a way that made it hard to breathe. This wasn't just elder abuse. This wasn't just fraud. This was coordinated coercion of a vulnerable man for financial gain, and they believed they would get away with it. They believed no one would see what they did in the shadows. They believed no one would fight for him. They were wrong. My hands finally steadied as I gathered the files, organizing them with the precision of someone preparing evidence for a mission briefing. Every frame, every sound, every timestamp would matter. The military trained me for investigations like this one, but nothing compared to the drive that came from defending someone you love. I closed the laptop, snapped it shut, and sat in the quiet of the truck while the morning wind swept over the valley. My grandfather had tried to protect Mercer Ridge his entire life. Now the responsibility had shifted to me, and I would not fail him. I drove straight from the Overlook to the office of our family attorney, Martin Hale, a man who had known my grandfather for 4 decades and who handled most of the Mercer's land matters long before Linda entered the picture. His office sat inside a narrow brick building across from the courthouse, the kind of place where the walls smelled faintly of old paper and the floors creaked with every step. When I walked in, still carrying the burn of the USB footage in my chest, he looked up from his desk and froze. "Rowan," he said slowly, "something's wrong." I handed him the folder of printed copies of the forged contract and watched his expression darken with each passing line. He set the papers down, exhaling through his nose the way he always did when preparing to deliver hard truth. Rowan, listen carefully because this is urgent. If Linda files this contract with the land office before you challenge it, the county will assume it is legitimate, even if it's forged. My pulse stuttered. Even if we have proof. Proof slows them down, he said, but it does not stop the filing from going through. And if it goes through, you'll be spending months trying to reverse it. Linda knows that, which means she's probably planning to file first thing tomorrow morning. His words landed sharp and fast. Tomorrow morning, less than 24 hours. Every instinct inside me tightened. Martin continued. If she gets that paperwork stamped, the land transfers legally, and dismantling a fraudulent land transfer is a brutal fight. This was more than urgency. This was a race against time, against deceit, against a woman who believed speed could bury the truth. What do I have to do? He leaned forward, lowering his voice. You need to file a protective challenge before she gets there. You need to put the county on notice that the signature is disputed and that the witness and notary are compromised. If you do that before she files the transfer, the clerk is required to freeze everything until a judge reviews it. I checked my watch. It was already past noon. Offices closed at 5. I had 5 hours to get everything in place, including notarized statements, printed evidence, and a protective petition. And that was assuming Linda wasn't already preparing to strike first. Martin began pulling forms from a drawer, stacking them in front of me. I'll prepare the petition. I'll draft the emergency protective notice. But Rowan, he paused, looking me squarely in the eyes. I need you to understand something. You are walking into a legal ambush. If Linda filed anything today, before we submit this, we might lose Mercer Ridge. A pressure built behind my ribs, heavier than dread. I nodded once sharply. I'll beat her there. I stood gathering the papers when his phone buzzed. He ignored it until the third buzz, then looked down, his brow tightening. It's the land office clerk. Let me see what this is. He answered. Yes. This is Hale. A pause. Then another. My stomach dropped as the color drained from his face. He ended the call, slowly looked up at me and said, Rowan, she filed preliminary paperwork this morning. My vision narrowed, the room compressing into one tight point. What does that mean? It means we're not ahead of her anymore. It means you have hours and not a full day. It means if she brings the notarized deed tomorrow morning at 9, they can finalize it on the spot unless we get our challenge processed first. A clock began ticking somewhere inside me, loud, relentless, echoing through my pulse. She had moved faster than I expected, but she was not going to win. I gathered everything in my hands, ready to sprint to the courthouse when my phone rang again, the hospital number flashing across the screen like a blow. My heart stalled. This is Staff Sergeant Mercer. Is he all right? The nurse's voice was steady but somber. Rowan, your grandfather's condition has shifted. His breathing became more shallow. We've moved him into higher observation. You should come when you can. My breath caught and held trapped like ice inside my lungs. Not now. Not while everything was unraveling. Not while I still needed him to see justice come through. I hung up slowly, the phone heavy in my hand. Martin studied me with quiet sympathy. Go, he said softly. But you must file before they open tomorrow morning. Do not let grief distract you. This is what they are counting on. I forced myself to nod, though my throat felt locked. I walked outside, feeling the cold hit my face hard enough to sting. The world suddenly felt tilted, pulling me between two separate battles. My grandfather was slipping away, and I might not have much time. And if I failed to act quickly, Linda would steal the land he worked his whole life to protect. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles went white. For a moment, I had to close my eyes just to steady the chaos inside me. Emotional undulation hit hard, a sudden dip pulling me into the fear I had held back since the night began. What if I lost him before the truth surfaced? What if he never knew I fought for him? What if he died thinking he failed to defend what mattered? The thought of him lying in that hospital bed, struggling for every breath, carved something sharp inside me. But soldiers do not freeze in fear. We move because fear reminds us what we are fighting for. I drove to the courthouse parking lot and sat there preparing the documents Martin emailed while the winter light thinned around me. Every minute felt like a grain of sand slipping out of reach. Tomorrow at 9, everything could be lost. My phone buzzed with another update from the hospital. His oxygen is fluctuating. We're monitoring him closely. My chest tightened again, but I kept filling in the forms, my hands moving with a mechanical steadiness born from years of mission training. Protect the objective. Defend the vulnerable. Do not break. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. I sat alone in the dim of the truck, staring at Mercer Ridge in the far distance, the land he loved, the land he feared would be stolen, the land that carried every memory of our family. I whispered into the empty cab of the truck, a promise that felt like a vow forged inside my bones. Hold on, Grandpa. I'm coming, and I will not let them win. By the time I left the courthouse parking lot, a plan had begun forming in the back of my mind. Not impulsive, not emotional, but precise, the way every effective operation begins. Legal filings could stall Linda for now, but stalling was not enough. People like her thrived in shadows, in closed rooms, in whispered manipulation. The only way to break her hold was to drag everything she had done into the brightest light possible where the entire community could see it. Helena was small enough that reputations mattered, and old enough that people believed deeply in protecting their elders. If the legal system moved slowly, the court of public integrity would not. Social court, a place where truth hit harder than any gavel. And there was only one location in town with enough history, enough symbolism, and enough gathering power to host the kind of exposure this situation needed. Legion Hall. The American Legion building sat near the edge of town, its weathered brick front visible from the main road, its flag always at half-mast during winter storms, out of respect for veterans who had passed. Sunday pancake breakfasts were held there. Veterans shared memories there. And older residents of Helena gathered there to discuss land policy, snow removal, and everything in between. It was the heart of the older generation, a place where my grandfather had spent countless afternoons swapping stories with friends who had served long before me. If truth needed to be seen, this was where it needed to happen. I called Martin first, outlining the idea as it came together in sharp, clean lines. He didn't hesitate. If you want this to work, you need people who know your grandfather. People who will stand tall when the video plays. And you need medical voices. If the VA nurse will speak about his condition, it will close any doubt. I nodded, gripping the phone with a tightening sense of purpose. I'll get them there. Next, I called the VA hospital, asking for the night shift nurse who had cared for Arthur when he was first admitted. When she heard my voice, she didn't wait for me to explain. Rowan. I saw the bruising myself. If you need me to speak, I will. Her steadiness anchored me. Thank you. Truly. Then came the final piece. The community. I drove through neighborhoods my grandfather had walked for decades, tapping into the network he maintained with quiet loyalty. I stopped at the hardware store where he used to buy lumber scraps. I visited the coffee shop where he always left a tip too large for the college kids working the counter. I knocked on the doors of neighbors who watched over his cabin during storms. And every time I said the same words, softly, deliberately, with the weight of gravity behind them. I need you to come to Legion Hall tonight. It's about Arthur. People did not hesitate. People who respected him came. People who had shared meals with him came. People who owed him nothing but kindness came simply because his name meant something. As the hours thinned toward evening, I drove to the Legion Hall, unlocking the back door with the spare key old Mr. Jensen had kept under a brick for decades. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of varnished wood and coffee brewed too long. Rows of folding chairs sat neatly stacked against the wall. I began setting them out one by one, creating orderly lines facing the old projector screen at the front of the hall. My hands moved with steady purpose, but inside me the emotional tide pressed low. The hospital had called twice more that afternoon. He's resting, but still unstable. His oxygen dipped again. Rowan, I'm sorry he's not improving. Each message sliced a thin line of fear through me. Fear that tonight's truth would arrive too late. Fear that he would never know I fought for him. Fear that he would never see justice served. But fear sharpened resolve. It didn't weaken it. By the time Martin arrived with legal folders under his arm, the hall was half full. Elderly veterans in denim jackets. Neighbors bundled in thick coats, the VA nurse carrying a clipboard, a few MPs from base who heard what happened and showed up without being asked. They filled the seats quietly murmuring concern as the room took shape around us. "Are you ready for this?" Rowan Martin asked as we walked to the projector table. "I'm ready for whatever the truth brings." He studied me for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "You have the backbone of a soldier and the heart of your grandfather. That combination is rare." I swallowed once, trying not to let emotion disrupt the clarity I needed tonight. The USB sat in my pocket, the files inside it capable of shattering every lie Linda had constructed. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were undeniable. The front door swung open sharply, pulling every gaze in the room toward the entrance. Linda stepped inside first, wearing a tailored coat and a smile too polished for a gathering she believed was casual. Tyler followed her smirk already forming as he scanned the room, seeing the older faces, the familiar hall, the setup that looked far too formal for the discussion I had told them about. Rowan Linda called brightly as though we were old friends meeting for a harmless chat. "What is all this? Why is the whole town here?" "You said this was simply a misunderstanding to clear up." Her tone attempted lightness, but irritation slipped through the edges. She did not like being caught off guard. Good. That was the point. Tyler crossed his arms, leaning back as if he owned the place, or at least believed he would soon. "Are we really doing this? Bringing half the town into family business? What are you trying to prove?" I stepped forward, letting the quiet of the room thicken around us. "I'm not proving anything. I'm showing something. And everyone here deserves to see it." Linda scoffed. "Really? Rowan, this is so dramatic. Just because you're military doesn't mean everything has to be some operation." Behind me, Martin stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Actually, this is a community meeting about elder rights and land protection. And since you two were involved in recent events, it is best you hear the truth alongside everyone else." The flicker in Linda's eyes, that small flash of panic, told me she finally sensed danger. But it was too late. The chairs were filled. The hall was silent. The projector hummed softly, waiting. I walked to the front, placing the USB onto the laptop connected to the screen. Tonight wasn't just about exposing fraud. It was about forcing their actions into the open where mirrors were everywhere and lies had nowhere to hide. "This is the beginning of the truth," I said, my voice steady, carrying through the hall. "And tonight, everyone sees it." The moment the hall filled to capacity, I felt the atmosphere shift into something dense and electric, the kind of silence that forms before a storm breaks. Linda and Tyler walked in with the swagger of people who believed they were still in control, people who assumed this gathering was nothing more than a dramatic gesture from a soldier who could not separate emotion from duty. They did not understand yet that their world had already begun collapsing. They took their seats in the front row as though they were the guests of honor. Linda crossed her legs, smoothing her coat, her chin lifted in practiced superiority. Tyler sprawled back with a smirk, tapping his foot like he was counting the seconds until he could laugh at whatever accusation I planned to throw. I stood at the podium pretending to adjust the microphone while the crowd settled. It gave me a few seconds to study the two faces that had caused so much damage. They still had no idea what was coming. Perfect. When the murmurs died down, I began with a measured calm that hid every ounce of resolve inside me. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight is not about anger. It's about clarity. And before we move to legal action, I wanted us to talk as a community, as neighbors, as people who believe our elders deserve protection." Linda let out an exaggerated sigh. "Rowan, please. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. If you wanted to clear up the confusion, you should have talked to us privately. We could have spared everyone the spectacle." I forced a small nod as though conceding a point. "You're right. Maybe this is unnecessary. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I reacted too strongly." Her eyebrows rose triumphantly, already believing she had won. Tyler leaned over to whisper something to her that made her smile wider. But I continued, letting the word cut through the air like a blade. "There's a simple way to settle this. We can watch exactly what happened. Together." A ripple ran through the audience. I saw Linda stiffen. Tyler stopped smirking. I clicked the remote in my hand, and the projector screen behind me brightened into a washed white glow. And then, with the precision of a mission trigger, I pressed play. The hall fell silent. The footage began exactly as it had on my laptop, Arthur sitting weakly in his chair, the October light slanting across the table as he struggled to read the papers in front of him. Then Linda's voice, sharp and impatient, filled the hall through the speakers. "Just sign it, Arthur. You're making this harder than it has to be." Her voice echoed through the room. Several elderly veterans shifted in their seats, their expressions tightening. Then Tyler's voice cut in loud, mocking. "Just sign it, Arthur. You're old. You won't even notice the difference." You could feel the oxygen leave the room. The video showed Tyler grabbing Arthur's wrist, forcing the pen between his trembling fingers. Showed Linda hovering over him, pushing the papers closer as he shook from exhaustion and fear. Showed Arthur trying to pull away, his breath ragged. The sound of his labored breathing filled the hall, magnified by the speakers, making every person present feel the weight of what they were witnessing. When the video ended abruptly, just as Linda moved toward the camera, there was no immediate reaction, just stillness. Heavy, horrified. And then it broke. An older woman in the third row, someone who had known my grandfather for 40 years, stood up, her voice trembling with fury. "Shame on you!" Another voice joined from the back. "How could you do that to him?" A veteran near the aisle shook his head. "That's elder abuse. Plain as day. You both ought to be ashamed." The crowd erupted with murmurs of disgust, disbelief, anger, pure, unfiltered community outrage. Linda's face had drained of color. Her hands trembled as she stood abruptly. "That's taken out of context. You don't understand what was happening. He wanted us to help him. He asked us to manage things." Tyler shot to his feet defensively. "This is a setup. You don't know what he was like toward the end. He didn't know what he was signing half the time." Voices rose again from the seats. "That's because you intimidated him. You forced him. You lied." Tyler glared at the audience, his bravado unraveling as quickly as his composure. "This isn't fair. You're all being manipulated by her because she's military. She thinks she can boss all of us around." He jabbed a finger toward me, but I didn't move. I didn't need to. The community had already taken the stand for me. I lifted the microphone. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't assistance. This was coercion. You tried to take land that didn't belong to you. And when my grandfather became too difficult to manipulate, you left him outside my barracks gate to freeze. Gasps erupted. A man in the front whispered, "Dear God." Linda shook her head violently. "Stop it. You're twisting everything." The door of the hall opened then. 2 Helena police officers stepped inside, one in uniform, one in plain clothes. They paused just long enough to understand the dynamics unfolding in front of them. The plainclothes officer stepped forward. "We received the evidence from the attorney's office tonight. We need to speak with both of you. Now." Tyler's bravado dissolved. Linda's knees buckled slightly as she tried to regain a facade of strength, but there was none left to find. The officers approached. One addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for your cooperation. This is now an active investigation of elder coercion and potential fraud. We appreciate your patience." The shift in the room was palpable. Justice had stepped into the hall. Linda looked around in panic, realizing every person she once manipulated, charmed, or fooled now saw her for who she was. When the officers asked her to step outside, she finally understood she had lost. Tyler clenched his jaw but followed. The moment they left the hall, a wave of relief and vindication rolled through the audience. Whispers rose, heads shook. People touched my arm with gentle reassurance, offering strength. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension release from my spine. The truth was out. The social court had spoken, and the real fight, the legal one, was now unavoidable. But for the first time since the night began, I felt the shift. Justice had begun. 3 days after the public exposure at Legion Hall, the winter sun hung low over Helena, casting long blue shadows across every porch and driveway. The investigation had already begun tightening around Linda and Tyler, with Helena PD requesting additional statements and the county attorney contacting Martin for documentation. Word spread fast in a town like ours. People who once greeted Linda with polite smiles now turned away. Tyler stopped showing up at the gym where he lifted weights mostly for show. Their world was shrinking. So when the knock came on my cabin door that afternoon, I already knew who it would be. I opened the door to find Linda standing on my porch, bundled in a coat far too thin for the weather, shaking not from cold but from panic. Behind her, Tyler hovered with swollen eyes, the unmistakable face of someone who had cried more in the past 12 hours than in the past 12 years. "Rowan, please," she said before I could speak, her voice breaking as she reached forward like we were old friends instead of adversaries. Her breath fogged in the air, the desperation clinging to her like frost. "Please, we need to talk." I stepped outside, silent, closing the door behind me. She flinched as if that single gesture struck her. Good. She deserved to feel the weight of boundaries for once in her life. Linda pressed both hands together, fingers trembling. "If you help us, we'll give back the land. All of it. Every document we filed, we'll reverse it. We'll sign whatever you want. Just please don't let this go further." Her voice cracked on the last word, the polished confidence replaced with a kind of beggary she had once mocked others for. Tyler stepped in front of her, attempting to control the plea. His voice wavered between anger and fear, thin and brittle. "I'll lose everything if this goes on. Everything. Rowan, you know how hard things have been for us. Can't you just tell them this was a misunderstanding?" My jaw tightened. A misunderstanding, forcing an old man's hand to sign away his land, dragging him outside in the freezing dark, leaving him at the gate like refuse. No, that was never a misunderstanding. That was cruelty with purpose, cold, deliberate purpose. Tyler's face twisted as he tried a different tactic, the performative sorrow he used whenever he needed sympathy. He wiped his eyes, sniffing hard. "I'm begging you. If this becomes a felony, I won't recover. My career will be over. My life will be over." I stared at him, letting silence stretch until he squirmed under it. When I finally spoke, my voice carried the calmness of a soldier delivering undeniable truth. "You should have thought about that before you put your hands on my grandfather." The words hit harder than volume ever could. Linda shook her head frantically, trying to recapture control of the narrative she had lost. "Rowan, you don't understand. We were under pressure too. There were debts. Tyler made mistakes. I made mistakes. But we didn't mean to hurt him. You can fix this. You just have to step in and say, 'None of this needs to go to court.'" She reached forward as if to touch my arm. I stepped back. Touch was a privilege she no longer had access to. "You left him dying at my barracks gate," I said softly, but each word landed like hammered steel. "You didn't call for help. You didn't stay with him. You didn't even try. You walked away. You walked away knowing he might not survive the night." Linda crumpled at the edges of my words like paper in fire. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but none of them moved me. I had seen real grief and real remorse in war zones. This wasn't that. This was fear dressed up as regret. Tyler tried again, his voice cracking. "You're really not going to help us, after everything our families have been through. Families." The word curdled in my throat. They had discarded that concept the moment they treated my grandfather's life as collateral for land they believed should be theirs. He had warned me about them. He had spent months trying to protect me from what he feared would happen. And he had been right. I inhaled once, feeling the cold air fill my lungs, anchoring me the way calm training always did before a decisive action. "I owe you nothing." The stillness of that sentence struck both of them harder than any shouted condemnation. Linda's hand fell to her side, limp. Tyler's mouth dropped open as if he could not comprehend that consequences had finally found him. I continued, my voice steady with finality. "You took advantage of an old man. You manipulated him. You pushed him. You scared him. And when you were done with him, you left him outside in the freezing dark like garbage. And now that there are consequences, you come here asking for mercy." Linda sobbed openly. "Rowan, please." "Don't ruin our lives. You already ruined his." I stepped back to the door, placing my hand on the knob. Linda staggered forward. "Rowan, wait. Let's talk about this. You can't just shut the door." I opened it slightly, then met their eyes one last time. "Watch me." And then I closed the door slowly, firmly, deliberately, sealing every plea, every excuse, every last thread of their dwindling control on the outside. On the other side of the wood, I heard Linda break into sobs and Tyler curse under his breath in a frustrated, helpless rage. But none of it moved me. Not after what I had seen. Not after what my grandfather endured. I leaned back against the door, exhaling long and steady, letting the quiet settle around me. This moment, the cold refusal, the final shutting out, was not cruelty. It was justice marking its first clean boundary. And as every American over 50 in Helena would later say when the story spread through diners and Legion meetings, they had it coming. The morning after I shut the door on Linda and Tyler, Helena felt colder than usual, the kind of sharp winter calm that arrives before major news breaks. I drove to base with the USB in my pocket. The same USB that had shattered their lies, the same USB that now held the potential to dismantle everything they had built on manipulation. CID had already requested a formal briefing. By the time I arrived at the office, the Joint Task Force room was filled with uniforms and suits. Army CID on one side, 2 FBI agents on the other, and the county attorney's liaison reviewing preliminary documents. The air buzzed with controlled tension, the kind that precedes coordinated action. Special Agent Cruz, a woman with the kind of steady presence that could silence a room, motioned for me to step forward. "Staff Sergeant Mercer, we're ready to view the material." I plugged in the USB and the room shifted instantly into procedural clarity. Faces sharpened, pens clicked. The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the projector came alive. The video played again. Arthur struggling to read the papers, Linda's sharp voice pushing him, Tyler's mocking tone, the forced signature, the tremble of a man who deserved dignity and got cruelty instead. No one in that room needed subtitles to understand what they were seeing. By the time the footage ended, Cruz exhaled slowly, her composure unshaken, but her eyes darkened with resolve. "This is textbook elder coercion," she said. "And depending on what the notary did, we may be looking at layered fraud." Sergeant Dana Caldwell leaned forward. "I told you from the start. They didn't just overstep. They engineered this." A CID investigator added, "If the signature was coerced, the contract is void. But if the notary was complicit, that's federal." Cruz nodded. "Let's break it down." Evidence Board 1 went up on the wall. They pinned the contract photocopies, the witness line with Tyler's name, the notary stamp from Caleb Dorse, the timestamp from the video. Evidence Board 2 filled with financial ties between the 3 of them pulled from early database queries. Then came the first strike. Cruz dropped a folder on the table. "Caleb Dorse accepted payment to notarize 3 documents last month without verifying signatures. 2 of those were connected to your grandfather." My jaw clenched. "How much?" She flipped a page. "Enough to cover overdue debts." Linda wrote the checks. So the notary was bribed. Fraud at the core. Check. Next came Tyler. A separate file slid across the table. "This Cruz tapped the page is going to be a problem for him. He recently took out a loan under false financial claims. When the agent reviewing his records called the bank, it triggered a fraud alert. The same week he helped force Arthur's signature." Dana muttered under her breath. "He needed collateral. Mercer Ridge." My stomach tightened, not with surprise, but with recognition. The land wasn't just valuable. It was leverage, a quick fix for their financial disasters, and they had been willing to sacrifice an 87-year-old man to secure it. The final folder dropped with a sound that cut through the room. Linda Mercer. Medicaid irregularities. False declarations regarding household income. 2 years of falsified statements. It appears she misrepresented your grandfather's condition to receive increased state benefits. Every word felt like confirmation of everything Arthur had feared. They never cared about him. They cared about what they could extract from him. Cruz leaned back, folding her hands. With all 3, linked bribery, elder coercion, property fraud, state benefit fraud, we are moving this into federal jurisdiction with CID cooperation. Dana looked at me. "Rowan, we need your full statement. Everything from the gate to the confrontation." I nodded and began recounting every detail: the freezing night, the security footage, Arthur collapsing in the snow, his whispered words, the forged contract, the ransacked cabin, the USB, the public exposure at Legion Hall. Every sentence pulled the story taut, weaving motive, opportunity, and intent into a clear trajectory, one aimed entirely at destroying my grandfather's autonomy. When I finished, Cruz stood. Staff Sergeant Mercer, based on the evidence presented here, are the charges we anticipate: 1 felony elder abuse, 2 felony coercion to obtain property, 3 fraud through misuse of notarial authority, 4 forgery with intent to defraud, 5 Medicaid fraud, 6 conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The room fell quiet. Dana broke it with a faint whistle. "That's enough to bury them." The county attorney agreed, stepping forward with a stack of pre-drafted warrants. "And we intend to." The process moved fast from there. Signatures, digital filings, interagency coordination. Within hours, arrest teams assembled. By afternoon, I received a message from Cruz. "It's done. Linda and Tyler have been taken into custody. The notary as well." I sat in my truck outside the hospital when the message came through, watching the snow drift lazily across the parking lot. The world felt too still for the magnitude of what had happened. 3 people who had believed themselves untouchable were now facing the full force of federal consequences. And yet, part of me felt no triumph, only a quiet, unwavering certainty that this was the beginning, not the end. Justice was moving, but my grandfather was still fighting for breath inside the building behind me. I stepped out of the truck and looked toward the hospital entrance, feeling the cold settle deep in my bones. The law was doing its work. Now I had to face the deeper truth, the one that mattered more than any indictment. I whispered softly, as if Arthur could hear me even from his room 3 floors up. I kept my promise. And I'm not done yet. The Montana courthouse in Helena always looked imposing to me, but on the morning of the trial it felt heavier than stone, as if the building itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. The sky outside was a clean winter blue, brutally bright, the kind of cold light that reveals everything whether you want it revealed or not. I walked through the front entrance in uniform, not because I needed the authority, but because I needed the steadiness it gave me. Each step echoed off the marble floors as if marking time toward something irreversible. Inside the courtroom, the air was tight with anticipation. Reporters lined the back row. Locals filled every available seat. Helena was small enough that everyone either knew Arthur or knew of him. They had heard about the Legion Hall meeting, the arrests, the investigation. Today, they were here to see the truth held up in daylight. At the defendant's table sat Linda, pale and trembling, her eyes swollen from nights of crying she had brought upon herself. Beside her was Tyler, his jaw tight, his arrogance hollowed out entirely. Further down the table sat notary Caleb Dorse, attempting to look harmless, but unable to hide the unease twisting his posture. Their attorneys whispered to them, but none of them had the confidence of people expecting victory. Judge Halverson entered, a respected figure in the community known for fairness, but also for zero tolerance toward dishonesty. His presence commanded immediate quiet. The prosecution began by establishing the timeline: the drop-off at the Barracks gate, the medical condition of my grandfather, the forged contract, and the cascading lies that followed. Then the moment came when the lights dimmed slightly and the projector flickered on. The USB video. The courtroom fell into a cold silence, so complete I could hear someone in the back stop breathing. The footage played out exactly as it had in that task force room, Linda gripping Arthur's wrist, Tyler hovering over him, the forced signature, the line, "Sign it, Arthur. You're old. You won't even notice the difference." The tremor in my grandfather's hands, the fear in his eyes, the manipulation, the pressure, the cruelty. No one in that room remained unmoved. When the video ended, the stillness shattered into a ripple of gasps and quiet outrage. Judge Halverson's expression tightened. One juror closed her eyes as if holding back tears. Another shook his head in disbelief. Justice was no longer abstract. It now had faces, actions, and consequences. Next came the witnesses. First, the VA doctor. He testified calmly, clinically stating that Arthur's injuries and condition were consistent with prolonged exposure, forced movement, emotional distress, and significant vulnerability. He confirmed the bruising patterns. He confirmed the danger Arthur had been placed in. He confirmed that no one had called for help. Then came the notary expert testimony. They explained how the signature on the contract was inconsistent with Arthur's known writing patterns. They demonstrated the tremor. They explained that signature coercion is identifiable and prosecutable. And then it was my turn. When I stepped up to the witness stand, I felt the weight of everything that had happened press into my chest, but I didn't let it shake my voice. I placed my hand on the rail and spoke plainly. I told them about the night of December 14, about the freezing air, about seeing my grandfather collapsed outside the barracks gate, about the note Linda left, about hearing him whisper about documents they made him sign. I told them how I found the cabin ransacked the safe, destroyed the pills scattered in the forged contract waiting like a wound across his legacy. I told them what it felt like to hold his hand in the ambulance and realize that someone who should have cared for him had nearly abandoned him to die. As I spoke, the jurors watched me with rapt attention. A few wiped their eyes. One man clenched his fists on his knees. Even the defendants couldn't look away. Linda stared down at the table, unable to face the truth. Tyler stared at the wall as though hoping the paint might swallow him. Caleb sat rigid, knowing full well the severity of what he had participated in. When I finished, the courtroom held its breath. The defense attempted half-hearted arguments about confusion, mental decline, misunderstandings, financial pressure, but no one believed them. The evidence was too strong, the video too damning, the testimony too clear. By late afternoon, the jury withdrew to deliberate. They returned in less than an hour. A verdict that fast was never a good sign for the defendants. Everyone rose when the judge entered. The clerk asked if the jury had reached a decision. The foreman stood holding the folded verdict forms. "Yes, we have." The room froze. For the charge of felony elder abuse, guilty. For the charge of fraud, guilty. For the charge of coercion to obtain property, guilty. For the charge of forgery, guilty. For the charge of Medicaid fraud, guilty. For the charge of conspiracy, guilty. The words struck each defendant like hammer blows. Linda collapsed into tears, shaking uncontrollably. Tyler stared ahead hollowly, as if watching his imagined future crumble in real time. Caleb swallowed hard, unable to mask his dread. Judge Halverson delivered the sentencing with solemn precision. Linda Mercer, 6 years. Tyler Donovan, 4 years. Caleb Dorse, 3 years. The courtroom murmured its approval in a restrained but powerful wave. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered with unmistakable clarity. Then came the final ruling on the land. Judge Halverson declared the contract void due to coercion and fraud. Mercer Ridge was ordered to be returned fully and immediately to Arthur Mercer with protections in place to prevent any future attempts at exploitation. A warmth rose in my chest, not triumph but relief, a deep exhale I had held for weeks. The land that held generations of my family's history was safe. My grandfather's dignity had been restored in the eyes of the community, and the people who had tried to take everything from him were finally facing the consequences of their choices. As the courtroom emptied, several older residents approached me quietly. They shook my hand, nodded in respect, offered words that carried the weight of shared values and hard-earned wisdom. "You did right by him. He raised a warrior. You protected your own." I stepped outside into the cold, blue Montana evening. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, settling gently on the courthouse steps. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't feel heavy. Justice had found its footing, and so had I. Winter in Helena began to loosen its grip slowly, as if the season itself understood that the storm around our family had finally broken, and now it was time for everything to thaw. The snow on Mercer Ridge that had once looked harsh and unforgiving began melting in soft, uneven patches, revealing dirt paths and pine needles, and the familiar lines of the land my grandfather had fought so hard to keep. For the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling a weight lodged behind my ribs. I spent the earliest mornings repairing the cabin he loved so much, the one that had been ransacked in the chaos of Linda and Tyler's scheme. I replaced the splintered door frame first, then the broken lock, then the window they had forced open. I swept the floors until they no longer crunched beneath my boots. I reorganized his scattered pills and reassembled the safe, even though we no longer needed it for documents. Every nail I drove into the wood felt like stitching a wound. Every board I sanded felt like restoring something the world had tried to take. Arthur watched me from his old armchair when he was strong enough wrapped in the thick plaid blanket he had owned for decades. Recovery was slow but steady. The VA doctors warned me he might feel weaker for months, but each day he pushed himself a little further, sitting upright, longer, walking from the living room to the kitchen without my arm under his elbow, drinking more water, speaking with a little more strength. Some mornings he would drift off mid-conversation, and I would watch him with a swell of protectiveness that made my throat tighten. He had been to the very edge of survival and fought his way back because he wasn't done yet, because the truth needed to be told, because somewhere inside him, he trusted that I would not let his story end at the barracks gate. As winter receded, we fell into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. I would spend the morning fixing something around the cabin, then we would share lunch together, simple meals of soup or sandwiches, always with him insisting he could help even when he barely held the spoon steady. Sometimes he would nap afterward while sunlight crept across the wooden floorboards. Other times we would sit quietly, each lost in our thoughts, letting silence be something healing instead of heavy. One late afternoon, as the air turned warm enough to open a window, I brewed us 2 mugs of hot tea, the way he liked it, black strong, and poured into mismatched ceramic cups he had collected over the years. He tapped the side of his mug appreciatively and murmured, "Haven't had tea this good since your grandmother made it." I smiled because I had heard him say that since I was 10, and because comparing me to her was his highest form of praise. We stepped outside onto the porch where the view stretched wide across Mercer Ridge, the land glowing amber in the low sun. Birds hopped across exposed patches of earth. Melted snow trickled down the slope in narrow, shining threads. The ranch's history lived in every inch of that view, my great-grandfather building the first cabin by hand, my grandfather carving walking paths through the trees, my own childhood footsteps chasing the dog through tall grass. For a long time, we said nothing. We just watched the land breathe again. Eventually, Arthur leaned back in his rocking chair, his voice low and raspy but steady. "You know, he said you protected more than land." I turned to look at him. His eyes were bright with that familiar mix of gentleness and steel. "You protected our name. You protected what it stands for." It was the kind of praise that didn't inflate pride, but rooted itself deep, quiet, unwavering, and true. I felt something inside me warm and loosen a knot of tension unraveling after months of fear, anger, and relentless determination. I had worn my uniform in court because it reminded me who I was, but in that moment standing on our family's ridge, I realized I had done more than defend him legally. I had restored something deeper, something generational, something that would outlive both of us. I sat on the porch step, letting the sunlight spill across my boots. "Grandpa," I said softly, "I didn't do it alone. You held on. You fought. You gave me the truth even when you could barely breathe." He chuckled weakly. "Well, I always did have a stubborn streak. You inherited that too." The breeze brushed across us, carrying the earthy scent of thawing soil. It felt like a promise that the worst was behind us and that the land itself approved of how things had ended. Days turned into weeks, and each one brought a little more normalcy. Neighbors dropped by with casseroles and fresh bread. Veterans from his old unit came to visit, offering quiet nods of respect. Even strangers from town sent cards thanking him for standing up against exploitation, telling him he reminded them of their own fathers or uncles or grandparents who had once been taken advantage of. Arthur read every letter slowly, his finger tracing the sentences, his eyes softening with gratitude. Healing wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady work, like repairing a cabin or brewing tea or opening the curtains to let in spring light. It was the way he called me kid again with affection rather than worry. It was the way he started humming old songs while shaving. It was the way he looked out at Mercer Ridge and no longer looked afraid. One evening, as we prepared dinner together, me chopping vegetables and him instructing me from the table like a general planning a campaign, he suddenly paused and said, "I never wanted you to carry this burden." I placed the knife down gently. "You didn't give it to me. they did, and I chose what to do with it. He nodded slowly, accepting that truth before whispering another one. I'm proud of you, Rowan. Proud of the soldier you became. Proud of the woman you became. The warmth in my chest spread slow and full. We ate dinner with open windows, the cool spring air filling the cabin with the scent of pine and wet earth. Later, as night fell and stars appeared above the ridge, I understood that healing wasn't just for him. It was for me, too. For the part of me that had carried resentment, fear, and anger for far too long. For the soldier who had faced battlefields both foreign and domestic. For the granddaughter who finally knew she had done right by the man who had always believed in her. And for the first time since this began, I felt peace settle across my shoulders, not as a weight, but as a blanket. Soft, warm, earned. Spring in Helena came quietly this year, as if the land itself understood how much darkness had finally lifted from our lives. Snow melted in long, uneven ribbons, exposing the dark soil beneath. The air turned crisp in the mornings and warm in the afternoons, and each time I stepped outside, I felt as though the entire valley was exhaling. After everything that had happened, the mess, the betrayal, the courthouse battles, the endless worry over my grandfather's health, I realized I no longer wanted to live on base full-time. I still respected the uniform and the duty that came with it, but a different kind of responsibility was calling me home now, one that I could not ignore. So I filed the request for reassignment to Helena's Army Reserve Liaison Office, a position that would keep me in service but allow me to remain close to Arthur. It was approved faster than I expected. When the email arrived, I read it twice, letting the words settle before finally allowing my shoulders to unclench. I imagined the endless nights ahead where I would not be 2 hours away, unable to reach him in time. I imagined mornings where I could check on him simply by walking across the porch. For the first time in a long while, I felt my life tilt into alignment. With that decision made, I turned to the cabin that had once belonged to my father, the same one he had sold during his second marriage to Linda. It had sat on the far side of the ridge, a weathered little structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. But it had always held a strange pull on me. Even when it slipped from our family's hands, I felt its absence the way a person feels a missing tooth with their tongue, a small, persistent gap that never quite stops aching. When the owners put it up for sale after hearing about the trial, I walked through the cabin with slow steps, letting memory guide me. The living room still smelled faintly of pine and old books. My father's initials were carved into the back of a closet door, something I had forgotten about until I touched the shallow grooves with my fingertips. I purchased it without hesitation. The bank papers were straightforward, the transfer clean, nothing like the nightmare Linda and Tyler had tried to create for my grandfather. Signing my own name felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been stolen years ago. Renovation became my steady rhythm. After taking care of Arthur's needs each morning, I would head to the old cabin wearing a tool belt and determination. I replaced insulation-stripped rotten wood and fixed the porch railing. Some days, I worked in absolute silence, listening to the creak of old floorboards beneath my boots. Other days, I played my father's old country music through a small speaker, letting the notes lift dust motes into gentle swirls. Repairing that cabin taught me more about healing than any therapist ever could. Each cracked board had a story. Each loose nail, a memory, each window pane, a reflection of the past that no longer held power over me. I was building something real. Something grounded, something that belonged wholly to my family again. Meanwhile, Arthur continued gaining strength. He could walk to the mailbox now, leaning on a cane he carved decades ago. He spent afternoons reading in his favorite chair, sometimes dozing off with the book slipping from his hand. His laughter came easier. His eyes no longer carried fear. The day he visited the old cabin, he paused at the doorway, looking around quietly as if seeing ghosts only he recognized. After a long silence, he tapped his cane lightly on the floor and said, "You did good, kid. Real good." I smiled because those words carried the weight of years. On an early summer evening, we sat together outside his home, watching dusk roll over Mercer Ridge. The sky glowed warm gold at the edges, fading into soft lavender. Pines cast long shadows across the ground, and a gentle breeze stirred the grass. We shared simple conversation about the weather, the repairs, the deer tracks he noticed near the pond. After a while, he grew quiet. I could feel him searching for something deeper, something that had been building inside him for months. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "You broke the cycle, kid." I turned toward him, letting the words anchor inside me. All my life, our family had carried unspoken wounds, resentment between generations, bad choices repeated again and again, patterns of silence, avoidance, and denial that shaped us more than love ever did. Linda's cruelty was just one branch of a bigger root. My father's tendency to look the other way, his refusal to stand up to her, his distance from his own father, all of it had carved a legacy of pain that none of them had ever confronted. But Arthur was right. I had. Not because I wanted revenge, though justice mattered, but because I refused to let their choices define the ending. I looked back toward the ridge, watching sunlight fade across the land. The fields were soft with the new green of early summer, the evergreens dark and tall against the evening sky. For the first time since childhood, I imagined a future there, one defined not by survival, but by peace. Maybe I would plant a garden behind the old cabin. Maybe I would adopt a rescue dog. Maybe I would let myself finally rest. My life would still include the Army, but now on my terms. I had given years to service and would continue to do so with pride. But the part of me that had always stood guard over my family, that part was ready to breathe again. I placed my hand over my grandfather's, resting lightly on the arm of his chair. He smiled without looking at me, the same gentle smile he used to give me when I was small and unsure, but trying anyway. As the last light slipped behind the ridge, I understood fully that peace was not something you stumbled into. It was something you built plank by plank, choice by choice, truth by truth. And I had built mine in the very place where everything almost fell apart. If you have ever watched someone you love struggle because of the selfish choices of others, then you already know how deep those wounds can cut and how long they linger, even after the truth finally comes into the light. Stories like mine are not just about land or papers or courtroom decisions. They are about the quiet moments afterward, the ones where you sit with the people who matter and realize how close you came to losing them and how much strength it takes to stand up when family becomes the very thing you need protection from. Many people carry those battles in silence because it is hard to admit when someone who shares your blood has also caused your deepest pain. But I want you to know that if you have ever been there, if you have ever protected someone who could not protect themselves or stood firm even when you were outnumbered, you are in good company here. And if this story reminded you of something you lived through or someone who deserved better than what they were given, feel free to share your city in the comments. I want to see just how far stories of courage and resilience like this can travel, because when we speak them aloud, we remind others that they are not facing these struggles alone. And if you have ever broken away from toxic family patterns or found the courage to say enough to someone who tried to take advantage of the people you love, then this story is for you. You are not alone, not now, not ever.